The comm channel cut off mid-word. Not static, not distance. A clean cut, the kind a person makes on purpose. I was 3 corridors away, carrying a crate of filtration coils toward the maintenance bay, when Ellen's voice stopped, like someone had taken scissors to it. 1 second she was telling me about a valve she'd fixed twice that week. The next, nothing, not even breath. I dropped the crate, didn't look where it landed. Ran. Threshold Station has 40 kilometers of corridor, half of it curved so you can't see more than 30 meters ahead at any point. I know every meter of the stretch between the cargo bay and Ellen's workshop. I have walked it enough times that my feet found the way before my head caught up. Doors. Turns. A cargo hauler I nearly went through instead of around. I reached her shop, breathing like something being chased. The door was open. That was wrong on its own. Ellen locked it every time she left, even to get food, because she said tools grow legs if you let them. The lights were on. Her chair was pushed back at an angle nobody sits down from on purpose. On the floor, half under the workbench, was the multi-tool she gave me 2 years ago. The one that never worked right. I picked it up without deciding to. My hands did it before the rest of me agreed. I stood there for longer than I should have, turning a broken tool over and over, thumb finding the same worn groove it always finds. Like if I fixed it this time, it would fix everything else too. It didn't turn on. It never does. I put it in my pocket anyway. Station security took 11 minutes to arrive, which on threshold counts as fast. The officer who came was a broad-shouldered Kethrani named Dov, someone I'd traded nods with for 2 years but never spoken to beyond that. He looked at the open door, the tipped chair, the dust patterns on the floor, where something had been dragged rather than walked. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for a datapad. No forced entry, he said, mostly to himself. No struggle markers on the frame. I said nothing. That's not unusual for me. People on this station have stopped expecting words out of my mouth, the way they'd stop expecting rain in a place with no clouds. I grew up on Karn, where talking wastes air you might need for something else, like running, or screaming, or holding your breath under acid rain until it passes. I learned early that silence keeps you alive longer than most sentences do. But this time the silence wasn't a choice. It was a door slammed shut on the inside of my own skull, and nothing was getting past it. Dove crouched by the tipped chair. There was a trade delegation docked here since yesterday. New species. First contact status. Real formal. Real polite. He glanced up at me. You know them? I shook my head. Neither did I, until an hour ago. He straightened, tucking the datapad under his arm like it weighed more than it should. They call themselves the Voron. Big on ceremony. Bigger on teeth. I stared at him. Rue, he said, and it was strange hearing my name out loud, like it belonged to someone else, someone whose day hadn't just come apart at the seam. I need you to understand something, and I need you to hear it plain, because I don't think anyone else on this station is going to say it to your face. I waited. The Voron have hunting rights. Old treaty. Older than the station. Older than most of the species that signed it. Any sapient species that hasn't been formally ranked under Deathworld protection statutes is considered open territory for licensed pursuit. He said the words like they tasted bad going down. Ellen's people never ranked. They never needed to. Nobody's ever hunted a looming before. The floor didn't move. I did. I don't remember crossing the room. I remember my hand on his collar and his eyes going wide, and somewhere behind my teeth, a sound trying to get out that wasn't a word. Wasn't anything with edges, just noise, just the pressure of every unspoken thing I'd swallowed since I was old enough to understand that talking gets you killed, slower than it gets you saved. He didn't fight me off. He just said, quiet, I'm not the one who took her. I let go. Anger is a strange kind of relief. On Karn, we didn't have therapists or support circles or any of the soft language the core worlds use for feelings. We had anger, and it was useful. And it was honest, and it never once lied to me about what it wanted. Every other feeling I've ever had needed translating. Anger just needed pointing. I pointed it at the station's records office next, and when that got me nothing but shrugging clerks and diplomatic immunity forms too dense to read in an hour, I pointed it at the trade registry, and when that got me a printout with Ellen's name reduced to 4 cold words. Class 2. Unranked. Low resistance expected. I stopped pointing it anywhere and just let it sit in my chest like a coal that wouldn't go out. Low resistance expected. They hadn't just taken her, they'd graded her first. Filed her like livestock, like she was a number on a manifest instead of a person who fixed things with her whole heart, even when the things couldn't be fixed. Who talked to me for 2 years without once needing me to talk back. Who kept a spare cup on her shelf just in case I decided, on any given day, to want tea. I went back to my bunk. I didn't sleep. I sat with the broken multi-tool in my lap, turning it, thumb finding that same groove. And somewhere around the 40th turn I finally let myself think the sentence I'd been keeping outside the door in my skull. They are going to hunt her for sport. I stood up before the thought could finish landing. Threshold Station's docking ring holds 40-some vessels on a slow day. I walked the ring end to end, reading hull markings, checking manifests through the public terminals, looking for anything that wasn't a trade hauler, or a diplomatic shuttle, or a tourist skiff too soft to survive contact with open space, let alone a species that hunted people for entertainment. I found it near the end of the ring, docked at a berth too small for it, like the station hadn't quite believed it needed a bigger one. The hull was dark, matte, unornamented in a way every other ship on that ring wasn't. No flags, no corporate branding, no welcome lights blinking a friendly greeting to whoever walked past, just a name stenciled along the bow in letters plain enough to read from 50 meters. The Blackthorn. I didn't recognize the registry prefix. I didn't need to. Something in my chest, the same something that used to warn me about weather fronts back on Karn, the same something that once told me not to drink from a stream 2 hours before the stream turned out to be full of glass-scaled eels, told me this ship wasn't like the others docked around it. A crew member stood near the airlock doing something to a maintenance panel that didn't look urgent. Tall, dark hair cropped close, a jacket with sleeves pushed up past the elbow despite the station's recycled chill. He whistled while he worked, off-key, cheerful, like there was nowhere in the galaxy he'd rather be than elbow-deep in wiring on a Tuesday. He noticed me before I said anything, which surprised me, because most people don't notice me until I want them to. "You're staring at my ship like it owes you money," he said. I didn't answer. Old habit. He didn't seem bothered by that either, which was its own kind of surprising. Most people fill silence like it's a debt they're afraid of. He just kept working, glancing up every few seconds, patient in a way that had nothing soft about it. "Name's Owen," he said eventually. "Deckhand, mechanic, occasional idiot. You need something?" I thought about turning around. I thought about all the reasons a silent girl, with no proof and no standing, had for not walking up to an unmarked warship and asking for passage into hostile space. I thought about the multi-tool in my pocket, and Ellen's empty chair, and the 4 words on that printout that had taken a whole person and folded her down into a grading category. Low resistance expected. They were wrong about that. I intended to make sure of it. "I need to speak to your captain," I said. Owen went still, screwdriver frozen halfway through a turn, and looked at me properly for the first time. Not the glance you give a stranger, but the look you give something you've just realized is a lot more dangerous than it appears. "You talk," he said, sounding almost delighted. "Didn't expect that." Neither did I, not really. My voice came out rough, unused, like a door hinge that hadn't moved in years and had picked today, of all days, to finally swing. "I need passage," I said, "into Voran space." Owen set the screwdriver down slow, the cheerful whistle gone from his face, though something behind his eyes had sharpened instead of dimmed, like I'd just handed him a puzzle he actually wanted to solve. "Voran space," he repeated. "That's not a tourist stop." "I know. They eat things that go there uninvited, sometimes literally. I know." He studied me a moment longer, taking in whatever a person like him takes in. The calluses on my hands, maybe, or the way I stood with my weight balanced like I expected the floor to try something, or the multi-tool-shaped bulge in my jacket pocket that I hadn't noticed I was gripping until his eyes flicked to it and back. "Wait here," he said, and disappeared through the airlock without asking my name. I stood on that cold docking ring, alone, for 6 minutes that felt considerably longer, running my thumb along the broken groove of a tool that had never once worked, thinking about a friend who talked to walls out of habit, and fix things nobody asked her to fix, and who somewhere, right now, was being catalogued as low resistance by people who had never once seen what she was capable of when she cared about something. They hadn't seen what I was capable of either. They were about to. The airlock hissed open again. Owen leaned out, all trace of hesitation gone from his face, replaced by something closer to an invitation. "Captain wants to hear this from you directly," he said. "Fair warning, she doesn't do the slow version of anything. You'll want to say it straight." I'd been saying everything straight my whole life. It was the only way I knew how. I stepped through the airlock, and the door sealed shut behind me, with a sound like a decision being made. The inside of the Blackthorn didn't look like a warship. It looked like somewhere people actually lived. There were dents in the corridor walls at knee height, the kind that come from years of careless boots, not battle damage. A hand-drawn chart taped near the mess hall listed something called snack rationing in handwriting 3 different people had clearly argued over. Somebody had painted a crude sun on the ceiling above the galley, yellow going patchy where hands had brushed it too many times reaching for the ration shelf beneath. Owen led me past all of it without slowing down, to explain any of it, like it was ordinary, like a warship with a hand-painted sun on the ceiling, was the most natural thing in the galaxy. The captain's ready room was small. A desk that had clearly been repaired more than once, a woman behind it with her boots up on the corner, and a mug in one hand that smelled, even from the doorway, like something had gone badly wrong with the coffee. "Captain Holt," Owen said. "This is the one I mentioned." The captain didn't stand. She looked me over the way a person looks over a tool they're deciding whether to trust with a job. Not unkindly, just thoroughly. "Sit," she said, nodding at the single chair across from her. I didn't. She didn't seem surprised by that either. "Owen tells me you want to ride into Voron space," she said. "That's not a request I get every day, and I get some strange ones. Want to tell me why?" I told her. Not everything. I didn't have the words or the patience for everything, but enough. Ellen, the open door, the tipped chair, the 4 words on the manifest that had turned a person into a hunting statistic. Captain Holt listened without interrupting, which was its own kind of respect, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, turning that terrible-smelling coffee in slow circles. "Class 2, unranked, low resistance expected," she repeated, like she was tasting the words the same way Dov had. "You know what that manifest tells me?" I shook my head. "It tells me somebody wrote that report without ever meeting the person they were grading." She set the mug down. "I've read 100 reports like that about my own species. Every single one was wrong." She stood, and even sitting she'd looked like someone who didn't need to raise her voice to be heard, but standing there was no mistaking it. This was someone people followed because following her felt safer than not. "Here's what I can tell you," she said. "The Foreign have hunting grounds on 3 worlds in their home system. Old preserve law says the prey gets released, gets a head start, gets tracked for sport under supervision. It's meant to look civilized. It isn't." "You know them," I said. Not a question. "We've had dealings." Something crossed her face, brief, gone before I could name it. "They like rules. Rules they wrote. Rules that always seem to bend in their favor, right up until somebody makes them stop bending. Will you take me?" She looked at me a long moment, and I understood, somewhere under the urgency clawing at my ribs, that she was deciding something bigger than a simple yes or no. She was deciding whether I was going to be a liability or an asset, whether a quiet girl with a broken tool and a missing friend was worth the fuel and the risk and the treaty complications that came with flying an unmarked warship into a predator species' front yard uninvited. "You ever killed anything?" she asked. The question landed flat. No judgment in it, just information she needed. "Yes," I said. "Ever killed anything that was trying to kill you first?" "Every time." Something in her expression eased, not quite a smile, more like recognition. "Where are you from?" "Karn." I watched the name land. Most people in core space have heard of Karn the way they've heard of black holes. A fact, a warning, something you nod at and move past without needing details. Captain Holt didn't nod and move past. She leaned forward, elbows on the desk, and for the first time looked at me like I was a person, instead of a puzzle. "I've read the survey reports on Karn," she said. 90% lethality rate for unprepared colonists inside the first year. acid weather cycles, gravity variance that breaks standard bone density in a generation, fauna that hunts in packs, specifically because lone predators don't survive long enough to reproduce. She paused. How many people made it off that rock alive, in your lifetime? Fewer than made it off dead, I said. She almost laughed. It came out as something quieter, more like respect finding its footing. All right, she said. Buckle up, Rue from Karn. We leave within the hour. I didn't ask why she'd said yes so easily, whether it was Ellen's case that convinced her, or my own history, or some older grudge against the Voran that had nothing to do with either. I didn't need the reason. I needed the ship moving. She gave the order before I'd finished stepping out of the room. The Blackthorn's crew moved like people who trusted each other with their lives on a weekly basis, which, I would learn, they did. Grace Doyle, the first officer, ran the departure checklist in a voice so calm it made the countdown feel almost boring, right up until the moment the station's docking clamps released, and I felt the whole ship shift under me like something waking up. Marcus Kell, the weapons officer, introduced himself by tossing me a ration bar without asking if I wanted one, then sitting across from me in the mess hall and eating his own like we were old friends catching up instead of two strangers on a ship bound for hostile territory. You're quiet, he said, not unkindly. I've heard. Good quality in a person, most days. He unwrapped a second bar. Bad quality in a poker player. You'd lose your shirt. I didn't know what poker was. I didn't ask. I was too busy watching the rest of the crew move around the mess hall, laughing about something involving a maintenance drone and a paint accident, arguing cheerfully over whose turn it was to clean the galley, one of them singing off-key while stacking cargo crates that, I noticed on closer look, were stamped with markings for hull-piercing ordnance heavy enough to crack a moon. Nobody treated the ordnance like it was frightening. Nobody treated the coming mission like it was frightening either. They joked. They argued about snack rations. They ran system checks with the same energy other people use for board games. And underneath every joke, every laugh, every argument about whose turn it was with the mop, there was a stillness in their hands when they touched the ship's systems, a precision that never wavered no matter how loud the joking got above it. I understood it before anyone explained it to me, because I recognized it. It was the same thing I carried, the same thing Karn had carved into me before I was old enough to know I was being carved. They had all killed something bigger than themselves, more than once, and none of them felt the need to mention it, because mentioning it would have meant treating it like it was unusual, and on this ship, apparently, it wasn't. I sat with that thought for a long while, turning the broken multi-tool over in my pocket, thumb finding its groove. 3 days into the flight, Captain Holt called me to the bridge. Scout ship, she said, nodding at the main display, where a small, fast-looking vessel had appeared on the sensor readout, closing distance from an angle that made it clear this wasn't a coincidence. Voran markings. They run border patrols on approach routes near their space, mostly to collect tolls from anyone new enough not to know better. What do they want? Money, usually. Sometimes cargo. Sometimes just the chance to remind people who's in charge out here. She didn't sound worried. She sounded like someone watching weather roll in, that she'd seen roll in 100 times before. Given that we're new to them, they're expecting an easy toll run, a polite freighter that doesn't know the rules yet. Are we polite? Grace, at the helm, made a sound that might have been a laugh if she'd let it all the way out. Not especially, no. The scout ship hailed us on an open channel a few minutes later, its voice translated into standard by a system that gave it a flat, formal cadence, all ceremony, and no warmth. It demanded identification, cargo manifest, and a toll payment calculated by mass and origin, all delivered in the tone of someone who had done this exact speech 1,000 times and expected the 1,001st to go exactly the same way. Captain Holt didn't answer with words. She answered by not slowing down. The scout ship's tone changed almost immediately, ceremony cracking into something closer to alarm, repeating its demand with more urgency, threatening consequences under something called Preserve Protection Statute, warning of escalating response if the Blackthorn failed to comply. The Blackthorn kept its course, kept its speed, didn't so much as twitch toward compliance. I watched Marcus at the weapons station, hands steady on the controls, face calm in a way that had nothing to do with confidence, and everything to do with certainty. The same certainty I used to feel on Karn, right before I put down something that had decided I looked like dinner. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't excited either. He was simply, quietly, ready. The scout ship broke off its hailing attempts and moved to intercept. "They're posturing," Grace said, unbothered. "Trying to force a stop so they can board and assess." "Let them try," Captain Holt said, and there was something in her voice now, something under the calm, old and patient, and entirely without mercy. "Marcus."
"Standing by."
The scout ship crossed into what I would later learn the crew called effective range, still broadcasting its ceremonial demands, still expecting the freighter it thought it was dealing with to fold the way every other unranked adjacent, or newly discovered species had folded before it. It didn't get the chance to finish its demand. The Blackthorn's response wasn't dramatic. No sirens, no shouted orders, no countdown. Marcus made a small adjustment to his console, quiet as flipping a page, and outside the viewport, the scout ship's reactor bloomed open in dead silence. A soundless flare of orange swallowed instantly by the vacuum around it, gone as fast as it had appeared, leaving nothing behind but drifting debris, and a stillness that felt, somehow, louder than an explosion should have been allowed to feel. Nobody on the bridge cheered. Nobody so much as raised their voice. Marcus logged the engagement in the same tone he'd used to note a maintenance completion, and Grace adjusted their heading like nothing at all unusual had just happened 300 meters off the port bow. I stood there, watching the last of the debris field catch the light and disperse, and something inside me that had been clenched tight since the moment Ellen's voice cut off finally, briefly, loosened its grip. I understood, watching that silent orange bloom fade into nothing, exactly what kind of ship I had asked to carry me into Voran space. I understood, too, exactly what kind of mistake the Voran had made when they decided a Class 2, unranked, low-resistance species was safe to hunt, without checking who her friends were first. "They'll know we're coming now," Grace said. "Good," Captain Holt said. "Let them wonder what we are." I found my voice then, the second time in 3 days, and it came out steadier than I expected, steadier than I felt, but true all the way through. "They already made one mistake grading her," I said. "They're about to make a second one grading me." Nobody on the bridge asked what I meant. Nobody needed to. Captain Holt looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes, and then she turned back to the display, back to the long, dark stretch of space between us and the world where Ellen was being kept like a trophy waiting to happen. "Set a course," she said, quietly. "This time, we're not looking for another toll booth. We're looking for a hunting ground." The ship's engines shifted pitch beneath my feet, a low hum settling into something patient, something hunting. I put my hand in my pocket, found the groove in the broken multi-tool, and held on. The Voran homeworld looked wrong from orbit. Green in the way a bruise is green, continents shaped like something had taken bites out of them. Captain Holt kept the Blackthorn well outside the range of any orbital sensors the Voran bothered maintaining, tucked into the shadow of a moon nobody had thought worth naming, and for 2 full days we did nothing but watch. I hated it. Every hour we sat still felt like an hour Ellen spent believing nobody was coming. "Patience isn't the enemy here," Captain Holt told me on the second day, when I couldn't stop pacing the narrow strip of deck outside the bridge. "Rushing in blind is. The Voran didn't survive as an apex species by being careless. If we go in loud, we hand them exactly the fight they're built for. And if we wait too long, then we go in smart instead of loud, and smart wins more often than people think." I didn't like it. I understood it anyway. On Karn, the animals that survived longest weren't the fastest or the strongest. They were the ones who watched before they moved, who learned a predator's rhythm before breaking it. I'd forgotten that lesson somewhere between the panic of Ellen's cut-off comm and the long dark stretch of the journey here. Captain Holt hadn't forgotten it. Neither, I realized, had her crew. They spent those 2 days doing something I hadn't expected from a warship crew at all. They watched. Marcus cataloged patrol patterns, timing the intervals between orbital scans down to the second, building a map of blind spots that shifted with the planet's rotation. Grace pulled comm traffic out of the local networks, not breaking encryption so much as listening to the shape of it, the volume, the rhythm, learning which channels carried real orders and which carried ceremony. Owen, of all people, turned out to have a gift for reading infrastructure, tracing power grids and transport routes across the 2 continents, visible from our angle, until he had something close to a living map of how the Voron Preserve actually worked, underneath all its formal language about honor and sport. "It's not really a hunt," he told me, on the second evening, spreading a projection of the preserve grounds across the mess hall table. "Not the way they dress it up. It's a performance. Guards on rotation, cameras on every approach, release points timed to a schedule. The prey doesn't get a fair chance. The prey gets choreographed." "How do you know?" "Because real hunts don't need an audience," he said, and something in his voice went flat and old, in a way that didn't match the cheerful mechanic who'd whistled off-key on the docking ring. "Performances always do." I didn't ask what he meant by that. Some silences you don't push on, because you recognize the shape of them from carrying your own. By the 3rd day, Captain Holt had what she needed. A guard rotation schedule, a release point pattern, a window, twice per local day cycle, when the preserve's central holding facility ran on a skeleton staff, while most of the security detail rotated to watch whatever performance was currently underway on the open grounds. "There's a problem," Grace said, studying the projection. "Getting one person in unnoticed is possible. Getting a team in is a lot louder. And loud is exactly what we don't want until we're ready for it to be loud." Everyone looked at me at the same time, like they'd all reached the same conclusion together, and were only now checking whether I'd reached it too. I had. "I go in alone," I said. Captain Holt's jaw tightened, the first real hesitation I'd seen from her since the ready room. "That preserve is built to hold apex predators' idea of prey. It is not built for a rescue. It's built for something that runs," I said. "I don't run first. I never have. Rue, on Karn, when something bigger than you corners you, the mistake is trying to look smaller." I found the multi-tool in my pocket without meaning to, thumb finding its groove, and for once, the habit steadied me, instead of just occupying my hands. Predators respect stillness more than fear. They read fear as an invitation. Stillness confuses them, makes them hesitate. That hesitation is the only opening a person my size ever gets. Marcus was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite place, something between assessment and quiet approval. "She's not wrong about predator psychology. I've read the Voron combat doctrine intercepts. They're built around provoking flight response. Fear-based prey behavior is what their whole hunting culture is designed to exploit. So don't give them fear-based behavior," Captain Holt said slowly, turning the idea over. "Give them something they don't have a doctrine for," I said. The room went quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that isn't empty, the kind that's full of a decision settling into place. "All right," Captain Holt said finally. "You go in during the guard rotation gap. In and out before the skeleton staff cycles back to full strength. We keep the blackthorn dark and close, ready to move the second you signal, and if anything goes wrong, it won't." "If anything goes wrong," she repeated, unmoved by my certainty, "we come in loud, and we stop caring about being quiet." "Understood. Understood." She studied me a moment longer, the same look she'd given me back in the ready room, weighing something I couldn't fully see. "You remind me of some people I've served with," she said finally. "That's not always a compliment. Tonight it is." They dropped me on the planet's surface 2 kilometers from the preserve's perimeter, in the dead hour between patrol shifts, under a sky the wrong color for anywhere I'd ever called home. The ground here didn't try to kill me the way Karn's did, and something about that felt almost unfair, like the planet itself was underestimating what it was dealing with. I moved through brush that smelled sharp and unfamiliar, keeping low, keeping quiet, counting the guard rotations Owen had mapped until the timing matched what I'd memorized back on the ship. The perimeter fence was easier to bypass than it should have been for a facility that called itself a predator's pride. That told me something about the Voron I filed away for later. They trusted their reputation more than their infrastructure. They believed fear alone would keep most intruders out, and for most species, most of the time, they were probably right. I wasn't most species. Inside the fence line, the preserve unfolded into something between a zoo and a stage set. Wide open ground broken by artificial terrain features, clearly built for spectacle rather than survival. Cameras mounted at intervals, designed to catch every dramatic angle of a hunt in progress. Owen was right. This wasn't nature. This was a performance with a body count. I found the holding facility exactly where the projection said it would be. A low, windowless building at the preserve's center, guarded by 2 Vahoran in the skeleton rotation Marcus had predicted almost to the minute. They were tall, built for speed rather than mass, with a loose-limbed alertness that reminded me, uncomfortably, of some of Karn's faster predators, the kind that hunted by outlasting you rather than overpowering you outright. I watched them for 6 minutes before I moved, learning the rhythm of their attention the way Karn had taught me to learn any predator's rhythm, before I trusted myself near it. They mistook my stillness for something familiar to them. I could see it in the way their posture shifted when they finally noticed me at the tree line. Not alarm. Not yet. Something closer to anticipation. The look of hunters recognizing what they assumed was frozen prey. One of them said something to the other, low, almost amused, in a language I didn't understand but whose tone I understood perfectly well. They thought I'd frozen. I let them think it a moment longer. Then I moved, and the amusement dropped out of their posture all at once, replaced by something they clearly weren't used to feeling on their own hunting grounds: hesitation. I was smaller than them, slower on open ground. Everything about my build should have told them I was exactly the kind of prey their whole culture was designed around. But I didn't run. I closed distance instead, low and fast and utterly without the fear their entire hunting doctrine was built to provoke. And by the time the first guard understood what that meant, it was already too late for the doctrine to help him. Karn didn't teach me to fight fair. Karn taught me to survive things bigger than myself by being faster to commit than they were to react. Neither guard raised an alarm. Neither guard got the chance. I stepped over them and kept moving. The holding facility's interior was colder than the outside air, lit by a dim amber glow that made everything look like it was underwater. Rows of cells, most empty, a few holding creatures I didn't recognize and didn't have time to feel sorry for. I moved down the row, reading whatever markings I could, my chest getting tighter with every empty cell I passed. I found her in the last row, in the corner cell, and for one terrible second I didn't recognize her at all. She was thinner than I remembered. Her hands, when she lifted them at the sound of my footsteps, were shaking in a way I'd never seen from her, not once in 2 years, not even the time a coolant line ruptured 3 feet from her face, but even shaking, even hollow-eyed, and starved in a way that made something in my chest crack down the middle. Her hands were doing what her hands always did. She was trying to fix something, a broken hinge on the cell's data panel. Useless, pointless, exactly the kind of thing she'd have fixed on a slow afternoon back on Threshold Station, out of nothing but habit and stubbornness. "Ellen," I said. Her head came up. For a moment she didn't seem to believe what she was seeing, and then her whole face broke open, not into words, because her voice had clearly been used for something other than speaking these past days, and hadn't recovered yet, but into an expression I didn't have a name for, and didn't need one for either. I got the cell open. My hands were steadier than I expected them to be, given everything. She reached for me first, and I let her, and for one held breath neither of us moved, and I didn't say anything about how thin she'd gotten, or what I'd seen on that manifest, or the 4 cold words that had tried to reduce her down to something less than what she was. I just took the broken multi-tool out of my pocket and pressed it into her shaking hands. "It still doesn't work," I said. She let out a sound that was half a laugh and half something rawer than that, and closed her fingers around it like it was the only thing in the room that made sense. That was when the alarm went off. Somewhere above us, a low, rising tone began pulsing through the facility, and I felt Ellen's grip tighten around my arm. "They found the guards," I said, already moving, pulling her with me toward the door. "Rue. We move now. Talk later." The corridor outside was already filling with the sound of hurried footsteps, alarms bleeding out through every speaker in the building, and somewhere beyond the walls, I could hear something enormous beginning to stir, engines and voices, and the particular chaos of a well-ordered system, realizing all at once that it had made a mistake it didn't yet understand the size of. I pressed the comm unit hidden in my collar and said the one word Captain Holt had told me to say if everything went the way it wasn't supposed to. Now. Somewhere above the atmosphere I imagined the Blackthorn's engines lighting up, patient no longer, and for the first time since Ellen's voice had cut off mid-sentence, 3 long days ago, I let myself believe we might actually walk out of this. The alarm didn't stop. It climbed instead, layering itself into a second tone and then a third, until the whole facility sounded like it was screaming at itself. I pulled Ellen down a side corridor Owen's map had marked as a secondary supply route, one the skeleton guard rotation wasn't supposed to bother checking during a normal shift. This wasn't a normal shift anymore. 2 guards down and a missing prisoner had a way of making every route someone's business. "You came alone," Ellen said, breathless, keeping pace despite everything her body had clearly been through. "Rue, you came here alone." "Wasn't alone the whole way." "That's not the same as—" "Save it," I said, not unkindly, and she huffed something that might have been a laugh, if there'd been air to spare for it. We hit a junction where the corridor opened into a wider processing area, the kind of space built for moving captured prey through intake with maximum ceremony, and on the far side of it stood 3 Vahoran in full patrol gear, weapons already raised, alerted by whatever internal system had flagged the breach. I stopped. Ellen stopped half a step behind me, her hand tightening on my arm. The lead guard said something in Voran, sharp and formal, the kind of tone that expects immediate compliance, because it has never once had to ask twice. I didn't understand the words. I understood the posture well enough. "Rue," Ellen whispered, "there's 3 of them. I can count. That's not helping." I almost told her that counting wasn't the part that worried me, that the part that worried me was whether the corridor behind us had a second exit if this one closed. But there wasn't time for reassurance, real or otherwise, because the lead guard's patience ran out precisely when the silence stretched a half-second too long for his liking. He moved first. I'd like to say I remember every detail of what followed, but the truth is, some of it blurred the way things blur when your body takes over faster than your thoughts can keep pace, drawing on lessons burned into muscle memory long before I ever left Karn. I remember the weight of the lead guard's first strike glancing off my shoulder instead of my skull, because I'd read the angle a half-second early. I remember Ellen's voice, sharper than I'd ever heard it, shouting something that turned out to be a warning about the second guard's flanking line. I remember the strange, cold clarity that settles over everything, when the only 2 outcomes left on the table are winning or not walking away, and how Karn had taught me a long time ago which of those outcomes I intended to choose. By the time the corridor went quiet again, all 3 guards were down, and I was down too, on one knee, a shallow cut along my forearm bleeding more than I would have liked, but nothing that would slow me for long. Ellen was already kneeling beside me, hands hovering like she wanted to help and didn't know how, the multi-tool still clutched in her other fist like a lifeline. "We need to move," I said, pushing back to my feet. "You're bleeding. I've bled worse for less." She looked at me like she didn't know whether to be furious or terrified or something else entirely, and settled, apparently, on all 3 at once. "That is not comforting." Wasn't meant to be. We made it 2 more corridors before the facility's main doors blew open behind us, not from an explosion, but from something worse, in the sense that it meant reinforcements had finally arrived in force. I heard the distinct, layered sound of many boots hitting the floor at once, and above it, a voice amplified through the building's speaker system, speaking in standard now instead of Voran, clearly intended for us. "Intruder, you have violated preserved sanctity and interfered with a licensed hunt in progress. Surrender the prisoner and yourself immediately, or forfeit any claim to leniency under preserved law." I didn't slow down. They think I'm still following their rules. "Are we?" Ellen asked, half a laugh, half a gasp, as we rounded another corner. "Never was." We broke out of the facility's rear exit into open ground just as the sky above the preserve split open with a sound I felt in my teeth before I heard it properly. The unmistakable, controlled roar of a ship, dropping fast through atmosphere with absolutely no intention of being subtle about it. The blackthorn came down like something that had made peace a long time ago with the idea of being noticed. It didn't land so much as arrive, settling into the open ground between the holding facility and the perimeter fence, with a precision that flattened a section of the preserve's carefully maintained terrain features, the ones built for dramatic camera angles during officially sanctioned hunts. There was nothing dramatic about this. It was simply, efficiently, exactly where it needed to be. The cargo ramp dropped before the landing gear had fully settled, Owen stood at the top of it, no longer whistling, weapons slung but ready, waving us up with the same casual urgency he might use waving someone toward a bus they were about to miss. "You two want a ride? Or are we interrupting something?" he called. Ellen let out a sound that was mostly relief, and made it up the ramp faster than I'd have believed possible, given the state she was in. I followed close behind, glancing back once at the swarm of Voron guards pouring out of the facility's rear exit, weapons raised, voices raised louder, all of it arriving about 90 seconds too late to matter. The ramp sealed behind us before my feet had fully cleared it. "Bridge," Captain Holt's voice said over the ship's internal comm, clipped and businesslike in a way that told me the calm from before had folded itself away somewhere useful. "Buckle in. This part isn't going to be gentle." It wasn't. The Blackthorn lifted off the way it had landed, with total disregard for the preserve's careful choreography. And I felt the ship bank hard, as something below us opened fire, projectiles or energy weapons or something else entirely. I couldn't tell through the hull, only felt the ship shudder once, twice, and then steady itself, as Grace's voice came through the comm, calling out evasive vectors with the same unbothered precision she'd used running the departure checklist back on Threshold Station. I made it to the bridge in time to see the planet's surface falling away below us, the preserve shrinking into an irrelevant green smear, and a handful of Voron interceptors climbing up from the surface in pursuit, fast and aggressive, and clearly expecting the freighter they still thought we were to be an easy target now that we'd shown our hand. "They're hailing," Grace reported, furious tone, something about violated sanctity and formal complaint filings. "Let them file," Captain Holt said, not looking up from the tactical display. "Marcus, discourage the interceptors. Don't destroy them unless they force it. We're not here to start a war. We're here to end an injustice. Copy that." What followed wasn't a battle so much as a demonstration, the kind of controlled, contemptuous efficiency that comes from a crew who have clearly done this exact dance before and know precisely how much force is required to make a point without making a massacre. Marcus disabled 2 interceptors with surgical precision, their weapon systems going dark without their hulls so much as scratching, and the remaining 3 broke off pursuit almost immediately after, apparently deciding that whatever we weren't worth the math. I stood at the back of the bridge, one hand braced against the bulkhead, watching the last of the interceptors peel away, and felt something in my chest finally unclench all the way. Ellen found me there a few minutes later, once the ship had settled into a stable climb toward open space, wrapped in a blanket someone had pressed into her hands the moment she stepped off the ramp, the broken multi-tool still clutched tight in her other fist. "You're bleeding," she said again, quieter this time. "Told you. I've bled worse." "That's still not comforting." "Wasn't trying to comfort you," I said. "Trying to keep you alive. Different job." She let out a breath that shook more than she probably wanted it to, and leaned against the bulkhead beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything at all, which was, I thought, exactly the right amount of words for what we'd both just survived. "They graded me," she said eventually, quiet, almost curious about her own memory of it. "Class 2. Low resistance expected." I read that. Were they wrong? I thought about the hinge she'd been fixing in a cell she had no reason to believe she'd ever leave, about hands that shook from starvation and kept working anyway out of pure stubborn habit, about a person who had survived days of being cataloged like livestock and still had enough left in her to reach for me first instead of falling apart. "They graded the wrong thing," I said. "They should have checked who you kept as a friend." Ellen looked at me for a long moment, something working behind her tired eyes, and then, for the first time since I'd found her in that cell, she smiled, small and cracked at the edges but entirely real. "I did," she said. "I checked very carefully. Behind us, the planet fell further away, and ahead of us, the long, dark stretch of space opened up toward home, and for the first time in 4 days, I let my shoulders drop the fraction of an inch they'd been holding rigid since the moment her voice cut off mid-sentence. We weren't done yet. Captain Holt had made that much clear before we'd even left the atmosphere. A rescue was one thing, but a treaty built on centuries of grading sapient lives like livestock wasn't going to unmake itself just because one ship had proven it could. But for now, in that quiet stretch of corridor with Ellen's shoulder against mine and a useless, beloved multi-tool clutched between us. Done enough would have to be enough. The Voran filed their complaint within a day of our departure from their system. Captain Holt showed it to me on the bridge display, translated into flat, ceremonial standard, full of language about violated sanctity and unlawful interference, and formal demands for reparation. She read it out loud, in a voice that had exactly zero patience left for ceremony of any kind. They want an apology, she said, and the return of what they're calling their lawfully acquired asset. I didn't have to ask who they meant by that. What happens now? I asked. Now, Captain Holt said, setting the datapad down like it had personally offended her, we make sure this never happens to anyone else's friend. That turned out to be a longer fight than the one on the preserve grounds, though nobody on the Blackthorn drew a weapon for it. Captain Holt filed a counter-complaint through channels I hadn't known existed, backed by sensor logs, guard rotation records Owen had quietly copied during our 2 days of watching, and testimony that didn't need embellishing because the plain facts were damning enough on their own. A species had been graded for sport hunting without ever being consulted, ranked, or even properly identified under any treaty that pretended to govern sapient rights. The complaint didn't stay quiet for long. Word moves fast in a galaxy full of species who've spent generations quietly worried they might be next on somebody's unranked list. And within weeks, the story of an unranked engineer's rescue from a licensed predator hunt had made its way through enough diplomatic channels that the old hunting rights treaty found itself, for the first time in longer than most species could remember, actually under review. Nobody asked the crew of the Blackthorn to help draft the revisions. They helped anyway, quietly, the way Captain Holt seemed to do most things that mattered, without asking permission, without waiting for gratitude, simply doing the necessary thing and letting the consequences sort themselves out afterward. Ellen recovered slowly over the trip back to Threshold Station, color returning to her face by degrees, strength coming back into hands that had spent days shaking around a hinge that didn't need fixing, and a multi-tool that had never once worked. She spent most of her recovery time in the ship's small workshop, tinkering with things that didn't need tinkering, because that was simply who she was, starved or not, frightened or not, and I understood by then that trying to talk her out of it would only take away one of the few things keeping her steady. I sat with her most days. We didn't talk much. We never had needed to. On our last evening before docking back at Threshold Station, she looked up from whatever wiring she'd been rerouting on a panel that had never been broken to begin with, and studied me with an expression I recognized from 2 years of friendship, the look she got right before she asked a question she'd clearly been sitting on for a while. "Rue," she said, "back at the preserve, when you told me to save the talking for later. I remember, you'd been silent with me for 2 years." She set down her tools, giving me her full attention, in a way that made something in my chest brace itself, without quite knowing why. "Even before all this, I used to talk enough for both of us, and you'd just listen, and I always figured that was because standard didn't come easy to you, because where you're from, maybe there wasn't much use for it." I didn't say anything. "But back there," she went on, quieter now, "when you gave that order to the captain, when you talked to those guards' postures like you were reading a manual, when you said save it later, like you'd said 1,000 sentences that easily before, that wasn't someone struggling with a language." She wasn't wrong. She rarely was, when it came to reading the things people tried to keep hidden inside broken machinery. "Why didn't you ever tell me you spoke it fluently?" she asked. "The whole time. Why did you let me think you couldn't?" I turned the broken multi-tool over once in my hands, feeling the familiar worn groove under my thumb, and thought about Karn, and about all the reasons silence had kept me alive there longer than any sentence ever had, and about how it had taken me 2 years on a station full of strangers to find one person worth breaking that habit for, even if I'd never quite gotten around to admitting it out loud. "Words cost something. Where I'm from," I said finally. "You learn to spend them like they matter, or you learn to spend them never." I looked at her, at the hollows under her eyes that were slowly filling back in, at the hands that never stopped fixing things, even when nothing around her needed fixing. I never had anything worth saying to anyone else. Ellen's throat moved like she was swallowing something bigger than words usually are. "And to me?" she asked, barely above a whisper. I held her gaze. steady the way Karn had taught me to hold anything I meant to keep. To you? I said. I just never ran out of reasons to stay quiet and listen instead. She didn't say anything back right away. She didn't need to. She reached over, took the broken multi-tool from my hands, turned it once in her own fingers, and for the first time since I'd handed it to her in that cold cell 4 days ago, something inside it clicked, faint and small, and entirely unexpected, and a tiny indicator light flickered weakly to life along its worn edge. We both stared at it. It's never done that before, I said. No, Ellen agreed, voice thick with something that wasn't quite a laugh, and wasn't quite tears either. It hasn't. Neither of us said anything else about it. Some things, I was learning, didn't need explaining any more than they needed fixing. They just needed to be let alone, and trusted to matter exactly as much as they clearly did. Threshold Station's docking ring looked exactly the same as it had 4 days earlier. 40-some vessels tucked into their berths, station traffic moving with the same unbothered rhythm it always kept, as if an entire galaxy hadn't just quietly shifted its rules while nobody was looking. Word of the treaty review had beaten us home, whispered station gossip already reshaping itself into the kind of story that gets retold at every docking bar for years. Dove met us at the airlock, datapad in hand as always, though his expression when he saw Ellen walking under her own power, thin but steady, was nothing like the careful professional distance he'd shown me 4 days earlier. Word's already spreading, he said. Something about an unranked species precedent getting rewritten. Nobody official wants to say the Blackthorn's name out loud, but everybody knows anyway. Let them wonder, I said, echoing words I'd heard someone else say not so long ago, and found I meant them just as fully. Captain Holt didn't linger for the credit. By the time Station Traffic Control finished processing the Blackthorn's arrival paperwork, she was already deep in preparations for departure again, some other corner of the galaxy apparently needing the particular attention her crew specialized in. Owen gave me a 2-fingered salute on his way past, still whistling off-key, like nothing about the last 4 days had been anything other than an ordinary Tuesday. You ever need a ride into somewhere you're not supposed to go, he said. You know where to find us. I didn't answer with words. I gave him a nod instead, the kind that on Karn used to mean everything a full sentence would, and something in his easy grin told me he understood it just fine. Ellen and I stood on the docking ring together, watching the Blackthorn's berth clamps release, watching that dark, unornamented hull ease away from the station and vanish into the wider dark beyond, patient and unhurried, exactly the way it had arrived. You know, Ellen said, after a long, quiet moment, the galaxy's going to remember this differently than we do. How's that? They'll call it the day the treaty changed, the day the hunting rights got rewritten. She turned to look at me, tired eyes steady despite everything, the fixed multi-tool now clipped to her belt where it had never once fit comfortably before. I'll remember it as the day my quiet friend finally had something worth saying. I didn't have a clever answer for that. I didn't need one. I just reached over, took her hand the way I should have done the moment I found her in that cell, and together we walked back into a station that had no real idea yet how much the rules it lived under had just been rewritten, one silent girl, and one small act of loyalty at a time. Somewhere out past the docking ring, in the long dark between one star and the next, the Blackthorn carried its quiet crew toward whatever corner of the galaxy needed them next, leaving behind nothing but a treaty in the middle of being rewritten, and a rumor, already spreading from station to station, growing with every retelling, about a warship that had arrived without warning, and the nightmare it had brought with it for anyone who still believed some lives were worth less than others. They were wrong about that. They always had been.